Welcome. I'm Jody Miller. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Business Talent Group, and I'm here to moderate what I think is a really exciting, important panel. We all spend at least a third of our lives working, and we are in the midst of enormous change in the way people are working, the way organizations are working. And just to give you a few facts, we're expected to have 11 jobs now before we're 50. Over half of the work in organizations in the coming years is going to be done by people who don't work for that organization. We have today a third of the workforce in the US that spends at least part of their time working independently. We have 75% of the workforce will be millennials in 2025. We have massive numbers of baby boomers about to retire. All of these forces, together with globalization, technological change, and the changing and often fraying relationship between employers and employees, have led us to a moment in time where it's take a breath and let's think and take the time to craft a future of work that really works, that works for employees, that works for the companies that need to get things done. And it's a very, it's a profound moment, and I think we have a terrific panel today to help us think about these issues, and I'll just introduce them quickly. Beth Steinberg, who's the SVP of People at Brightroll. Alexander Santamon, who is the CEO of GLG. We have Diana O'Brien, who is the first Chief Marketing Officer of Deloitte. We have Peter Grauer, who is the chairman, former CEO of Bloomberg, and the US chair of the 30% Club. And we have John Bishke, who is the co-founder and CEO of Intello. So I want to just start by talking about the organization, the firm. If you go back and you look at the theory of a firm, it was originally designed because it was more cost-effective to have people inside a firm that you controlled than it was to access them on the outside when you needed them. And that's how we developed into quite large companies. And today we're seeing rapid change. We're seeing everything from Elance and TaskRabbit and Uber and all kinds of electronic platforms. We're seeing companies like GLG, which offer hundreds of thousands of people with knowledge. So the ability to, and I'm going to quote Deloitte here, and I'm going to turn it over to Diana, to access talent is becoming as important, if not more important, than owning talent. I want you to comment. That's a very profound statement, and it has enormous implications for individuals as well as organizations.
So for us, it was a real turning point when we recognized that actually 50% of Deloitte is millennials. And the millennials don't want to work for a big company, and we're a big company. They also want to someday own, so many of them want to someday own their own business. So we knew that we had to do something different around capturing them and creating a relationship with them for life. So part of what we've done is think about how to own that relationship, whether they're with us or not.
Even when they're not with you.
Absolutely. That's the point of owning it when they're not with you.
So what does that mean? What does that mean for you?
So for us, we spend a ton of time investing in their leadership development. And in a panel earlier today, someone said we want our customers to be able to advocate for us. We want every former colleague to advocate for us. We want them to say, oh, but I was at Deloitte and that's where I learned this. That's where I got this development experience. These are my mentors and I rely now on them. So the connective tissue is there, whether it be in partnerships then, whether it be with colleagues that hire us then because they work then for businesses. So for us, it was a huge shift because we hire even today 17,000.
I was going to say, how large is the Deloitte community globally today, the whole community?
200,000 globally. And we do expect 50% of our workforce to be in alternative career models where they are designing the career model they want versus the career model of a consultant or an auditor.
Well, let's come back to that because I think it's a really important point. Alexander, you've got hundreds of thousands of knowledgeable people all over the world. How do you see organizations working with you? And you've done this for 10, 12 years now. How do you see them working with you today, and how do you think they should be working with you going forward, and what are you allowing them to do that they couldn't do before?
Well, we're interested in professional learning, so we're not quite in the category of people not working at companies. We're interested in how people who don't work at your company can help you grow, make better decisions, grow as an individual. So our business is a peer learning platform. I think many of you may know the business. We have a lot of customers here. Thank you. Appreciate that very much. But if you do know us, you probably think of us as a research company. We're well known on Wall Street in particular, in the private equity community. But we've expanded our mandate, and we think of ourselves as a peer learning platform where any professional can learn from any other professional. Not any professional, but any top professional can learn from another top professional. And so we have a membership of 500,000 members on one side, and we have about 1,500 customers on the other side. Those customers pay subscriptions so that they can do things like, and I'll just give you a couple quick examples. If you are like this morning, an investor was looking at a cell-tower financing business, doesn't know much about it. So this afternoon he'll talk to 3 or 4 people that have financed a lot of cell towers in the past, and that would be one typical GLG project. But we might, just as likely, an investor wanted to understand Japan last year, had a macro thesis about Japan. He took 5 trips to Japan and met with both our members and was escorted by our members around Japan. So what we're interested in is that's one side, and then the other side we're interested in how people teach as part of that. So what we find is that that expertise is readily available. People love to teach. One of my mentors is on the panel. I know loves to teach. People like to teach people as long as they're teaching people that are qualified. And I think that does have profound implications on how people work. You can grow in your career in totally new ways. One of our favorite things we do now is help CEOs find other CEOs to learn from. And if you think about the broader workforce, we have thousands and thousands of CEOs leaving jobs, and not just CEOs, but other people. And if they think about a way to give back, they could go teach at Harvard, that's a possibility. But they also could just mentor people that are coming down the line. And the key is making the right match. So that's what we're focused on, I think.
And Beth, you're an HR professional. How do you think about all of this new talent? People who you can learn from GLG, people who are former Deloitte, people who are in the world. How does it change the way you think about developing the human capital of your organization?
Yeah, well, I think the relationship between employers and employees has changed a lot. Now it's a reciprocal relationship, and an employer owes the employee something, and the employee owes the employer something. It's a very mutual relationship now. It's not where you just work, and that's the expectation. And I think companies need to evolve to that and provide learning opportunities for people so they can learn and grow, and ultimately that's the way that companies scale. And I work in very different environments than, let's say, Deloitte, that has so many employees. I work in companies that have a couple of hundred employees, but that grow very quickly, that may double over a year. And the problem that we have is that they grow so quickly. You often have people leading that have never led before. Perhaps it's their first job, and they're now expected to hire and lead large amounts of people. And so I look to finding ways where we can develop people quickly and inexpensively, because we don't have the large budgets in these startup companies. And so finding ways where we can bring in speakers to talk about experiences, and finding mentors and discussion groups, and just, I call it guerrilla learning, in ways that we can really start developing leaders very quickly to help companies scale. Because ultimately that is what is going to make these startup companies successful or not successful over time.
So Silicon Valley is always coming up with new ideas, and some of you may have read about a new management technique that the CEO of Zappos has been trying. It's called a holacracy, and for those of you who may not have read about it, it entails getting rid of all titles and actually getting rid of management, and creating circles to go after essentially projects. So dividing the work of an organization up and really thinking about it as a series of projects. And I wonder, John, you've started up a lot of companies. I mean, how do you think about management in a world where talent is coming and going quickly, where you're using a lot of outside talent? Are there new ways to manage that are better suited to this fast-paced world?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest things that we see, and we work with many of the fastest growing companies in the world on this specific question, is how do they approach talent? How do they approach finding the best people? And the companies that are winning the war, and in Silicon Valley, it's clearly a war in terms of what's going on, are the companies that place talent acquisition at the very top of the list of their priorities. But we see many companies who don't do that. We see many companies who will say, oh, HR is interesting, it's nice, but the real focus of our company is sales, or the real focus of our company is marketing. We watch them every day lose the talent wars to the companies that are placing that first and foremost in their priority.
What does that mean? I mean, what does it mean to place it first?
It just means that when you think about the level of sophistication, when you think about the level of budget, when you think about the resources put towards talent acquisition, those departments receive the same attention as the sales team, the same attention as the engineering team. In most companies, that's not the case. In most companies, the talent acquisition professionals are second-class citizens. And those are the companies, generally speaking, that lose the talent war. So I think what you're seeing is a shift in mindset, and you certainly see it at companies like Google and Facebook, where their approach to talent is completely different from most companies their size. And if you look at profitability per employee, revenue per employee, those companies are at the top of the list in terms of all global companies. So they're doing something right. And I think it's a great lesson for all of us to take a look at what those companies are doing and to say, how does that impact every company in terms of their ability to find the best people?
So Peter, you've been involved in running Bloomberg for a long time. Now you're chairman. How do you react to what John's saying? Do you feel that it's all about the resources in the HR department? Is it a mindset? What is it that...
I think, one of the, many of you have heard this before, but I took a team of our senior HR leadership out to Crotonville, which is GE's learning center, and spent a half a day out there talking about the whole issue of talent acquisition, future leaders, and things like that. And the statement was made by the woman who now runs that part of the GE business that Jeff Immelt spends 40% of his time on people. And that may well be indicative of the fact that the GE culture is so strong, and he's had such a tremendous legacy, both his predecessor and himself, in creating great leaders going forward. The issue of acquisition of talent, I think, obviously has to be followed up by an incredibly strong commitment to developing and retaining that talent going forward. And as part of that, I think organizations need to have a higher purpose against which they judge their performance. We do that, promote that very heavily in our country, in our company. I think you have to create an extraordinary work environment so that you attract the most diverse workforce that you possibly can. But I do think people need to spend a very significant portion of their time focused on talent, talent development, multi-generational talent development, to ensure that that pipeline is constantly being filled with people who are given unique opportunities to develop and become stronger leaders going forward.
And so, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, Jody, I think Peter's point's right on, and I think people miss this, but one of the decisions we made at Deloitte was to have all of our partners involved in learning and development. So everyone has to spend time doing that. And as a result, it became an executive conversation. And prior to that, I would say it probably wasn't as up, to your point, it wasn't at the forefront. But now that everyone's engaged in that, it's much easier to have that conversation because they get the benefit.
I mean, we all have the same challenge, regardless of whether you're John's size of company. We are 17,000 people. We have 2,000 temporary and contract employees. We have another 2,000 business process outsourced colleagues who work within the Bloomberg sphere on a full-time basis. But the fact of the matter is we are all in a war for talent.
That's right.
And as a consequence, if we're going to be able to succeed and hopefully maybe even exceed expectations, we just have to be so riveted on that opportunity, because that's what our success is going to hinge on.
Yeah. So I hear everybody saying talent matters the most. I also hear millennials don't want to work for a lot of the traditional corporations. I know there's a lot of job movement. Mm-hmm. What do you do today to attract the millennials? And by the way, if you put women in that bucket and baby boomers who may be towards retirement looking for a slightly different relationship between work and life, you have three huge demographic pools that probably want a slightly different kind of work experience. What's happening in the world that you all see to accommodate that, or not? Is that what's driving people to independent work? Is it because they can't find it? What do you see?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I want to stress one point that that Peter made. I mean, I think talent acquisition is one part of the equation, and acquiring people is certainly a very difficult thing to do, and getting them in your company is very difficult. But I think the more important thing is what you do once you get them in the company. And if you don't have a strong company culture, strong company values, and this cannot be driven by any HR department, and I say that as a longtime HR leader. This has got to be driven by the CEO and in conjunction with the leadership team. And I think that, I can speak with millennials who I work a lot with in Silicon Valley. I think more and more people of that generation that I see are really looking for meaningful work. More than anything, they want to make an impact, they want to make a difference, and that may not mean, going to work for a nonprofit, but that to them may mean super challenging problems to solve. So companies that may be doing something completely different, working with the team that they really gel with, where they feel like they're going to learn and grow. And so I think you have to look at lots of different dimensions of your culture and the values of your company and figure out how you really talk to the different types of employees that you want to acquire and how you really sell those things. But it has to be true. If you're just pretending, you're never going to get people to stay and you're never going to retain them. I think, we were talking about how outrageous some of the salaries are getting in Silicon Valley. And I think, companies that buy people are never going to be successful long term, because ultimately people will not stay. They will just go on to the next company that will write a bigger check. Ultimately, people need to feel engaged in their work. They need to feel good about what they do, good about the team that they're working with, and that's going to really drive retention and satisfaction, which most people want. Not everybody. Some people are just going to go from job to job and get the highest paycheck. That's okay. Some people are going to do that. You have to accept that. But I think engaging people in super meaningful work is really what millennials want.
And John, you have technology and data that helps you find out who's ready to leave, who's good to hire. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing and what you're able to do today that we couldn't do even 5 years ago?
Yeah, I'll talk about it at a macro level and at a micro level. At a macro level, part of what Intello does is we leverage big data to help companies better understand what talent is out there in the market, what talent has certain skills, what talent might be members of underrepresented groups. Diversity is a huge issue right now in Silicon Valley and more broadly. We help companies with that. And we also help companies identify people when they're at a certain point in their career where they may be likely to leave their job. And this was a big revelation for us a couple of years ago, that you can actually use big data, that you can actually use public data on the internet to predict the likelihood someone will leave their employer in the coming months.
So what kinds of things are clues, just so people may want to know that?
Go check up on
Don't want to leave the rabbit trails, yeah.
Well, there are a lot of them, and we've identified over 70 variables that are correlated with someone's propensity to move from job to job. One of the biggest things is people start to get a little more active on the internet when they're looking to change their job. They start to polish things, they start to change things, they start to add things, and it's all public information. And if you sat there and just clicked refresh on their profile all day long, you'd see it. We don't have the time in the day to do that, but at scale, it's possible to automate that. We've also found a very high correlation for how many months you've been with your current employer for, and this is something you can probably all take away into your companies. People leave their job at their calendar year anniversaries with a much higher propensity than mid-year. So if you want to check in with your employees, check in with them at the 10-month mark, the 22-month mark, the 34-month mark, because that's the point in time when they're starting to think, I'm almost at the 3-year mark, what am I doing with my life? And that's typically when they start to look for other jobs. So that was just simply an analysis of the data of millions and millions of resumes to say, actually, people do leave right on the calendar year with shocking propensity. And so that's something that we've learned at the macro sense. And then very quickly at the micro level, one of the questions that I ask whenever I'm interviewing someone for Intello, and I got quoted in the New York Times about this question, is, what do you want to do after Intello? And it's a question that it throws them in an interview because they say, well, I'm here to interview for Intello. Why are you asking me what I want to do next? And we realize that in this labor market, if you get 3 to 5 years from someone, you're lucky. Hey, 7 is a dream. So we think a lot at Intello about how do we help our employees prepare for what's going to come next. And by thinking about their professional development, we think that's one of the best things that we can do for them. And kind of paradoxically, they stick around longer because they know that we have their best interests at heart.
Interesting. Now, Alexander, you have a point of view that mentoring and teaching can actually be part of someone's professional development and growth. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think there's a great expression in medical school, which is see one, do one, teach one. And the idea is that you don't really know something until you've taught it. And so I think that is that should guide you in thinking about how you grow in your career. The more you teach, the better you understand something. And I don't mean you have to go again to Harvard for the semester, but if you sit down with another CEO or you sit down with someone who's growing in their career outside of your company in particular, because if it's in your company, you might know the subject matter, you know the person. But if you sit down with someone from outside of your company, you can get a sense of whole different types of questions, and I think you learn through that experience. So at GLG, an easy example is a scientist would learn about, if you're doing Alzheimer's research and a venture capitalist comes to you to learn about Alzheimer's research, you have an opportunity to shape where dollars go in Alzheimer's research, and that's exciting, but you also learn through the questions, what might be fundable in my lab? What kinds of questions do people that don't do the science have about this category of research? And if you extend that analogy to a CEO, I think you can come to the same place, which is if you're a CEO, you're going to learn from a more junior CEO as they ask you questions about how do you, for example, create a mission in a company. Mm-hmm. In describing that back, you might learn something about how to do that teaches you.
So that's peer-to-peer, something Deloitte does a lot of.
And I think it's so interesting because you have really an open talent, model that you're delivering, and we have, in terms of Deloitte University, a talent model where we do exactly that, where someone has a chance to come and practice and test things out, and yet they have partners around them who can then mentor and coach them about how they did. Or we might do a game, through an industry simulation where they have to make choices similar to what you just described, and then a group of people, sometimes even clients, are able to coach and mentor them, but it's in a safe environment so they can learn faster. To get to your point about how do you get leaders, how do you accelerate their development, it's really about these unique experiences as opposed to going to a classroom, which, you're doing that with your peer-to-peer, we're doing it as well.
So John, you just said, you'd be lucky to have 3 to 5 years from somebody today, and 7 would be out of this world. The great companies of the 20th century, Jack Welch and GE and Jeff Immelt, their claim to greatness came from keeping talent for 20 years, 30 years. We have a very diverse panel in terms of how many years we've each been at our jobs. Is the vision of hiring somebody, training them, and keeping them from 25 years dead? Is that still going to happen?
Our lens is Silicon Valley, technology, younger people. No one stays with their company for 20 years. But I do think that in different parts of the world, I grew up in the Midwest, people just approach their career differently. So much of it is just an awareness of what is the norm and looking at it very realistically. I don't think it makes any sense to pretend that people are going to stay around for 10 if the average is 4 in your industry or in your geography. So I think that's a big component in terms of how we look at it.
Yeah.
So we lose about 9% of our workforce each year. Which in the scheme of things for probably most people in this room is a pretty low number. It tends to be somewhat cyclical, tied to what's going on in the financial markets. Just so happens that we've been in a secular contraction for the last 7 years in the financial markets, so that's had a positive impact on our turnover. But from my perspective, a lot of this hinges on the quality of leadership in the organization. I am a very strong believer in the concept of intimacy. And what I mean by that is connecting with colleagues. And I don't refer to the people who work at Bloomberg as employees because I don't think of them that way. I think of them as colleagues. And part of that, the intimacy of that relationship and this relationship network that I think all leaders need to develop throughout their organization, and if they're global, they have to spend a lot of time on airplanes doing it, is giving the sense to people that, number one, they're very important to what we do every single day, and number two, we're going to invest in their future so that they can continue to grow, they can continue to have a fulfilling career, But thirdly, we're going to create a work environment for them so they feel to some degree they can control their own destiny. And I think creating that kind of unwritten contract between our colleagues around the world, driven by the leadership at the top of the organization and throughout the organization, kind of creates this sinew that exists and I think contributes greatly ultimately to an organization's success.
So you think it's still possible today?
I'm very old-fashioned. I'm going to be 70 years old in October. I've done this for 45 years. I believe intensely in humans' willingness to not only commit, embrace the concept of loyalty, and be grateful for having opportunities, provided you create the right environment for those opportunities.
And Deloitte, how do you all think about that?
Well, being one that stayed at the same place for 30 years, but had, almost 20 jobs in that time frame, I think it comes to your point. Am I given the opportunities to grow, and am I being mentored by people that I respect and want to be like? And so that's what you have to keep evolving and I think innovating on. But I do think that there'll be people who will find the right leaders to follow, and they'll do lots of different things as a result of that. And I think that's a way to capture people's attention.
Bethany?
And I think sometimes it is going to happen and sometimes it won't. I mean, I think there's lots of examples in emerging companies where there's entry-level positions and we get exceedingly qualified people applying for those, and we know it's not reality that they will stay at the company if we can't quickly promote them. But there are times when we don't have enough positions to promote everybody. There's so many examples of, Facebook in the early days, we had lots of Stanford and Harvard grads that did customer care. And many of them are still with Facebook. But many of them, we left the company and went on to graduate school or do lots of different things, and we were totally fine with that. And we were very open and honest about, we will give you a great experience. We hope you will do great work for us, and then we wish you the very best on whatever you choose to do if there is not a great opportunity for you to move on with your skill set. So I think that's just a reality when you have a lot of very qualified people wanting to get into a company. But I agree that the company does have a responsibility, in my opinion, to do the very best that it can to provide an environment where people want to stay and learn and grow. But sometimes in smaller companies, there is just not enough positions to do so.
And in terms of personal development, is this still on the company to develop? Is it on the individual, John? I know you talk about personal boards.
Yeah, we think it's shared, and we think we can do our part to help encourage people to walk through the door. Ultimately, they have to walk through the door. We have a concept that we talk about at our company a lot called a personal board of advisors or a personal board of directors, and we define it as 3 to 5 people who are 3 to 5 years further along in their career than you are. And so when you're at a small company, when you're at a company like Deloitte or Bloomberg, you find mentors inside the company because there are people that clearly have the career path that you want to go down. Not always the case in a small company. And so what we do is we actively work to connect the people on our team with people that are further along in their career than they are. And that really does a couple of things. First of all, it helps accelerate their professional growth. There's no better way to get to where you want to get to than spend time with someone who's already there. But second, it helps us to bring new ideas inside the company. So if I send out our head of marketing to hang out with the CRO at a 300-person company, not only is he building professional development by just spending time with that person, he's learning ideas that then might be applied to business problems at Intello. And I think our team has really appreciated the fact that we're really helping to connect them with a group of mentors and advisors. They still have to do the hard work. They still have to meet the people. But how do we open the door and allow them a chance to step through it?
So we've talked a lot about diversity at the conference over the last day and a half, and have all acknowledged the incredible job the Milken Institute did in bringing a lot of women to the panel and to the panels. And I want to talk about diversity. I know Peter's been incredibly active in chairing the 30% Club, and I want to understand as a granular level as you can help us understand, what is actually going to move the needle?
I don't think we know.
That's an honest answer.
And let me be a little bit more specific. So we've gone through a process where 22 separate managers in our company have submitted a plan, a 1-year and 5-year plan on diversity and inclusion, really kind of a talent plan, where they've committed to a recruiting strategy, a retention strategy, and then a development strategy going forward in terms of the work environment. And we've done some work with McKinsey, not from the point of view of using them as a consulting firm, but because they're going through the same issue within their firm. And we've talked to them, we've talked to Deloitte, we've talked to a number of other firms, and I always ask the same question. So who does it really well? And the answer is consistent from everybody. No one. And so this journey that we're on, I think, becomes quite personal in that we all want to achieve a much more inclusive environment, and we all want to do a better job on underrepresented groups. And it's not because it's the right thing to do, and you've heard this over the last day and a half. It's because there is a business imperative to do that. The data shows unequivocally that organizations that have more diverse cultures make better decisions and perform better. Whether you start at the board, whether you go to the C-suite, or you go to the next level of management, it's there. And so taking this challenge, where some of us, hopefully Bloomberg will be one, can really establish ourselves as a leader in this field so that other people can maybe think about emulating some of the things we've done, or we think about emulating some of the things that others have done. I think that's what we have to do. But I think it's an incredible challenge. I think it is, I say this all the time, and excuse me for the triteness of it, it is a race without a finish line. But if you don't start from the top of the organization to drive this kind of change and inculcate the necessity for long-term success to have this kind of a workforce, it's just not going to work.
So Deloitte just became the first of the big four to name a woman as CEO. And I think in general, Deloitte would be one of the companies I would have said is among the best at least thinking about how to make an environment work for a diverse group of people. You want to talk a little bit, Diane, about things you guys have tried, things that worked, things that haven't worked?
Well, it's interesting that Peter said you have to have that executive. It was 23 years ago that our then CEO decided, because of daughters that he had, that he was going to make women and that an issue for our firm and put it front and center. And so that started what was our women's initiative then. And so now, 23 years later, we have the first CEO in the US for our business. And I would say it's more than the mentorship, it's more than the programs, it's not that. It's really taking some risks, it's sponsorship, it's actively really going in, picking someone, and really putting them in the positions to learn and grow quickly. And I do think we don't challenge ourselves enough. Too many people stay where they are in their roles and don't keep learning and don't go and get additional experiences, whether that's from peers or people within the organization. And I'd say Deloitte did a good job of that. But we also sought a lot of advice from outsiders, similar to what you're saying, and asked others what they're doing to role model those things. But it takes a long time, so you can't wait on the commitment.
Well, so that's what's, talk about the timeline. I mean, with boards, you can actually see making progress pretty quickly. You've seen what Helena's done in England. It's been a pretty quick line up. But when you're talking about executive leadership, the top positions in major companies, that does take time. Are there anything you can do to accelerate? I mean, Alexandra, you've got a wealth of people who have knowledge, mentorship. I mean, is there any way to enable your group to help in this?
Well, I like the question. I think in our case, one thing we notice is that women are more interested in personal boards than men are. When we go out and talk about our service, we find that women, for some reason, grasp the idea really quickly, seek the help really quickly. I don't know what that says, but it might say something about what can be done.
Do you have as many women doing coaching, though, too?
No.
The reverse?
No, but that's because of the same problem. So most of the people that have gone farther are men, and therefore most of our membership are men. I actually don't have the data, I should, but I would say that anecdotally. I do have the data on the customer side, and I know that there's outside of Wall Street, which is also dominated by men, our customers outside of Wall Street tend to be people who see that they want to learn in new ways, and I would say women represent a fairly high percentage.
And I was interested in an earlier panel, people were talking about the relative ineffectiveness of chief diversity officers, for example, in many companies, and that they're not funded properly. I mean, have you seen things that the head of people can do to influence in a positive way?
Yeah, I mean, I think bring awareness is the only thing. I think, it's definitely a very big issue in Silicon Valley, as people have seen by all the recent, news coming out of Silicon Valley. And I think, most of what I see is unconscious bias and not things that are being done deliberately. And I think what I have tried to do in my role is simply bring attention to the issue to my CEO and the leadership team by doing things like having Frida Kapor-Klein, who's speaking on a panel next, talk about unconscious bias and do it in a way where I'm trying to educate people on the subject and bring people together around solving the problem rather than create polarization, that it's a woman issue and creating issues within the company around people thinking they're not doing the right thing. I also think there's a tremendous amount of things we can do around creating a bigger pipeline in Silicon Valley, and I think most companies, employee referrals are a huge way that people are hired. And because of that, they tend to be people who look like people within the company that are white males. And so I think we need to really think about how we increase the pipeline if we're going to get a more diverse pool of people into our companies.
I just say this issue of the chief diversity officer, again, I think it is heavily driven by the tone at the top of the organization.
Yes.
And I'll just use one modest example. I made the decision, and there are many others, but just from a personal point of view, I made the decision in 2007 to build a very strong sustainability effort within Bloomberg. One was our own corporate responsibility and our carbon footprint around the world. Second was, how do we educate our colleagues so that they're much more sensitive to these issues and play an individual role in the environment? And thirdly, how can we commercialize this so that there's some kind of commercial aspect? And I brought an individual who was a regional controller for us in Hong Kong, who had presented a business plan on this, had him sit with me, totally empowered him. He reported to me. At that stage, I was chairman, president, and chief executive officer, and basically gave him the opportunity to drive organizationally what we do around that issue. He still runs it today. We are, I think, certainly highly regarded in what we've done about sustainability, the role we play both internally and as a convener around sustainable issues. And obviously Mike's done a lot from Bloomberg Philanthropy's point of view. But I think empowering people coming from the top of the organization and kind of giving them that additional flex that provides within the organization, I think can enable us to really create a strong chief diversity officer, or head of sustainability, or whatever it may be.
So John, I was going to say,
yeah, there's another way too that I look at it, which is it's definitely a top-down, but it's also a bottoms-up approach. And I think there was a very interesting moment about a year ago, we're coming up on the first anniversary of it, when Google decided to publicly unveil their diversity statistics. And it changed the conversation in many companies, because for years, diversity recruiting has been about compliance. It's been about the OFCCP. It's been about making sure, CYA on this stuff, right? Now, when Google announces their numbers, and as Google goes, so goes the Valley, so Facebook and Twitter and Yahoo and other companies have come forward with their diversity numbers as well. What's going to happen this year if Google announces those numbers and those numbers got worse? That'll be really interesting from a press perspective to see how the press deals with that. So the pressure is on Google and Facebook and all of these companies to improve their diversity statistics. And if you improve your diversity statistics lower down the organization, then you can develop and you can train the leaders. Marissa Mayer and Sheryl Sandberg, and they had to start somewhere. And they started somewhere, and now they're running these companies. So if we can improve diversity from the bottom up, in addition to the top down, I think that's a tremendous opportunity. Then you do have more CEOs. Then you do have more women on boards. I think that's a big opportunity.
Assuming you don't lose them. I mean, one of the things we've heard over and over is that in graduate schools today and at the beginning of the pipeline, we have parity, about 50-50, but we lose the women. And so one of the things that I'm always interested in is the relationship between time and the career path. And is there a way that we have imposed really one model on how to achieve success in organizations that is so linked to time? It's not a sexy concept. And the reason I raise it is that as I listened to the debates about leaning in, and people were saying women aren't less ambitious, but they seem to make different choices. And it always seems to me it's because women don't like the world they're being asked to lean into, and that we need to think a little more creatively about how to structure that world. And that leads me to the whole issue of alternative models of work. So one example, in our own company, over half, probably 80% of our leaders are women, and many of them work less than 40 hours a week by choice. And that's how I am able to recruit and retain incredible talent. Now, that's a very unorthodox way to do things. It requires a different management. It requires a different way of thinking about work. But if you do it institutionally, what happens is, for example, I'm sure many of you have looked at employee performance charts where you rank employees, A player, B player, C player, high potential, meets expectations. In my experience, if someone is outstanding, but not working full-time, working 80%, they're never put in that top quadrant. Now, maybe that's just my limited experience, but they're not. They're not on the succession list. They're not. And I guess I would suggest that maybe we need to rethink some of those things and how we think about work. And that leads me to that whole bucket of telecommuting, part-time work, coming in and out differently. I mean, are these tools that companies can institutionalize, not just for women, but for everybody? Because as we've talked about, millennials seem to want a lot of the same things that women want, and in effect create organizational routes to the top that haven't existed before. Reactions. Possible, impossible?
Work-life fit for us is key, and whether it's working part-time, whether it's providing that flexibility. What we found was the reason when we started the Women's Initiative, we did research on the women that had left, and our thought was they were leaving to stay home. And what we found was that wasn't the case. They were leaving to do alternative and design a different job, and we needed to create a fit for them that didn't exist. And so for us, we've driven that around two components, flexibility and predictability, because that seems for, again, people in the professional services world to be two really important elements that could drive them away from the profession, but if they get some sense of that, it can draw them in. So for us, it's been a big deal.
Can they still be promoted?
Absolutely.
See,
I made partner being part-time.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Any other thoughts? I mean, is this a pipe dream? Can you imagine this at Bloomberg?
No.
Okay. That's an honest answer.
No, I mean, we need to be ever thoughtful about these issues on the one hand. On the other hand, we are, and I'm sure this is true of my colleagues, we're a place where people work hard. And the importance of the culture is underpinned, in our judgment, by coming to work every day. Now, there needs to be flexibility, and we need to be in the 21st century and all the other things. But that's kind of part of the cultural underpinning of the organization. And it's the culture that Mike created 34 years ago is now back helping us move forward. And that's part of our DNA. And so, yes, we need to be thoughtful and responsive on the one hand. I could never imagine half of the Bloomberg workforce telecommuting. It's just not. You know, we are so intensely customer service focused. We consider ourselves to be innovative and disruptive. We need to do this in teams and so forth and so on. And so I think that would be a push for us. Yeah.
John, what do you see? What do you guys see in the Valley?
I mean, I think it depends on the company and the culture. I think there's a lot of technology tools that make it very possible. I think it depends on the expectations set around communication. And I think it depends on the leadership of the team. And if a team is run in a way that the communication and the expectations are set properly and there's predictability, it can work. But I think it depends on the company culture. So I think some companies it can work, and there'll be no business disruption, and other companies, it's just not going to work for them.
Not gonna work.
I mean, how do you classify a company like Uber, right? I mean, Uber has people that work in their San Francisco office, work really, really hard, and then they have tens of thousands of people, some of whom may have driven you here today, right? And those people have flexibility. They can work whenever they want to work. They can pick up a phone and see that there's a ride that they can go. And so there's a model here that I think accommodates both. Companies that want people in the office, that believe that's part of the culture, that's what we do at Intello, but also leverages this huge, massive, untapped labor force out there that wants to work on their own time, wants to have flexibility, doesn't want a 9 to 5 in an office. And I think there's room for both.
I do too.
So tell me a little bit about data and how data can help us in ways to predict who's going to work for us and who isn't going to work, and just the world that you live in is a very different world than I think most of us are used to dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, data just is fundamentally changing every aspect of business. It's changed the marketing suite, the sales suite, and we just felt it would change the HR and recruiting suite, that was inevitable. And historically, HR and recruiting has not been very data-driven relative to other parts of the organization. So we, in some ways, are an innovative company, but in other ways, we're just a copycat. We're watching what the sales companies and the marketing technology companies are doing and saying, can you apply that technology to HR and recruiting? And a great example of this is companies that are doing predictive scoring around leads that are coming into their company to see which of those people are going to turn into customers. Well, in theory, you could do the same thing about the people that apply to work at your company. And you could predict who is going to come work for you. You could predict who is going to perform well for you. You could predict who is going to leave your company. And so we don't answer all of those questions at Intello, but we think that's the next wave around HR and talent management, is using data not to be a historical record of what happened in the past, but to predict the future.
So I think we're going to take some questions in a moment, but I thought we would just end this formal part by just asking everyone, what do they think is going to be different about the world of work in the next 10 years? Start with you, Beth.
I mean, I think it's going to be much more focused around mission, values for employees, and people who really just want a place where they can be proud to work, and creating a culture that gives them that.
I think a lot of this conference has been about changes in K-12 education, higher education, but I think it's a no-brainer that executive education will be fundamentally different in even 5 years, if not 10 years.
I agree with that. I would hope that what's different is we don't have the rank and yank approach anymore, and we have development that's really direct, and people provide real candor and focus on building their strengths as opposed to cutting them down. Pete?
So I think that companies that really operate to a higher purpose will exceed expectations, and there has to be some fundamental work around mission and vision to kind of underscore that. But 48% of the people who work for us today are millennials, and I think part of the reason they work at Bloomberg is because they know ultimately the world is going to be the beneficiary of Mike's philanthropy, which is the profitability that we create on a daily basis. And I think that's really distinguishing them and gives them so much more an important sense of ownership and purpose than in other places.
John?
Yeah, I think my largest concern is around the haves and have-nots, and whether that gap is getting bigger, and not so much have and have-not around wealth, but around skills required to be viable in the 21st century. So I think technology skills, I think design skills, some of the pieces where we work with companies that can't hire enough engineers that have all the advantages in the world. They're dying on the vine because they can't find enough engineering talent. And yet you have relatively high unemployment in all of these other sectors. So I think fundamentally matching the skills and how we're training people to the demands of the 21st century workforce, that's the biggest challenge and the biggest opportunity.
Yeah.
And I
Great
think
comment.
in 10 years, we actually won't be having these diversity discussions because there will be so many women in boards and in leadership positions.
We'll be obsoleted.
Yes, that's an option.
Right.
So I thought I'd open it up for questions, and I think there's someone with a microphone and who can help. Then we have a question I can see right up here. It's a little. Wait.
Hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm a millennial employee, and just to kick it off, I'm wondering if you think about traditionally what our elite colleges were built for, they're really designed for a very small number of people in our society who have more thought leadership or philosophical type roles. And today, most of our young people go through the same college system that's based around the liberal arts ideology. And that works really well for banks and consulting firms that have designed two-year rotational programs. We're seeing that two-year rotational model almost pervasive throughout all other industries as well, so that these people can actually gain skill sets and learn. How do you think that big companies like Deloitte or Bloomberg, who are recruiting en masse at these campuses, can play a role in driving the skill development earlier on in these people's careers when they're still in school in order to inform their longevity and their stay at your company?
So one of the things that I did a couple of weeks ago when I was in Singapore is I opened a Bloomberg finance lab at a local high school. And we have 6 or 8 Bloomberg terminals, and these are 10th and 11th graders. And while we were there, they were given a test, 10 questions, and they had to use the terminal to answer the questions. Now that's a little bit extreme, but the fact is, I think companies have an obligation to work with the next generations to help them to, I think to John's point, to be better prepared for the challenges they're going to face them. And I think we all have a stake in that game, and all can play an important role in helping.
I think that's exactly right. And I think when we built Deloitte University, while it was for initially the professionals that worked at Deloitte, we've extended that to many situations where we invite young people who are in college or in high school to Deloitte University for simulation exercises, for different problem-solving issues that our clients bring. So they have real-life concerns to address. And it's been fascinating and exciting to see, one, how that's affected the number of professionals we recruit that want to come work with us after the fact, but also when you hear them talk about their experience, how it changed their ability in terms of the types of skills they focused on, be it creativity or operating in a sense of with ambiguity, or thinking about real problem-solving architecture and how to go about solving that, which taps into a little bit of what you do.
It's a very interesting question, and there's a raft of new companies that are coming into to play to bridge the gap between college and work that are quite interesting. And the question is, how do you get that earlier in the cycle? And I think universities are thinking about that hard. I know there's a question up here.
So there's been a lot of talk about women and their place in the executive suite, and a lot of talk about millennials and retention and training new leaders. And from my point of view, no one addresses the problem of ageism. And if you look at, you want to see what's going on at Google and Twitter and all those places, you find somebody in the lower ranks that's under 40, over 40, and you will find a gem. And what I'd like to ask you is, do you think that this means that experience and wisdom and the things that an older person brings to the table are no longer valued, are no longer usable? How do we address that?
It's a great question.
It's a great
So
question.
as the oldest person on the dais, should I say something? I'm with you. We actually talked about this for a minute as we were preparing the group. I think it's an incredibly important question and issue. And, I think good organizations figure out how to accommodate that. And John and others on the stage may have different views about it, but there is this extraordinary wealth of talent that exists. I was going through and trying to figure out, so what really is a millennial? And I have a couple of millennials in my family and work with several millennials closely on my team. Then I saw the silent generation. You may be part of the silent generation with me, which is people who were born up to 1945. I'm not quite sure why we're the silent generation, but it underscores your comment a little bit. But I think there's a huge wealth of opportunity there.
I think
But I'm prejudiced.
I do have to say that I don't know if this addresses ageism, but I have seen somewhat of a shift where I used to see that some young CEOs, and I've worked with a lot of CEOs under 30, would not want to hire any executives who were over 30. And I've now seen that they have a bit more appreciation for experience than they used to. I still think it's a very big issue. I mean, I am always the oldest person on my executive team. I may not look like the oldest person, thanks to science, but I am usually the oldest person on the executive team, and a woman, which, you know, but I think it is a real issue. But I do think you're now seeing more companies in the Valley, John, I don't know if you would agree, that do have executive teams that have a lot of different ages on them and not just all extremely young people, but it is exceedingly rare that you'll see companies that have lots of people over 40 or over 50. So, you know, I don't know how you solve it. I do think, you know, again, getting a pipeline intentionally of people who have a lot more experience and seeing how much value they add to the company. So all these things around diversity, they have to be intentional and they have to start from the top.
Yeah, also things like, I mean, GLG, I think is a fantastic
this question's right in our wheelhouse. We have our membership, our employees are younger, but our membership, we like to say is old, meaning over 40. But the average person is 40, 50, 60, sorry. But really all the way up into their 70s, possibly older than that. And from a teaching perspective, I think there's a huge opportunity to re-engage. The key to teaching is making the right matches. But we see a huge opportunity for people to give back. And we also see real receptivity to hiring these kinds of people, older people, as mentors but it's very well received as long as the match is appropriate.
Matt, one of the challenges that I see, and I think this is only going to intensify, is that the skill sets turn over much more quickly now than they used to. So it used to be that you'd learn what you needed to learn in college, and then you do that for the next 40 or 50 years. Yeah. And there still are some professions like that, but increasingly you need to refresh your skill set every 4, 5, 6 years to be relevant in the workforce. So the big question will be, as people mature, as people get older in their careers, do they have that willingness to continue to go back every 5 years and relearn something? And if they do, I think they'll thrive. But if they're of the mindset that I can learn something in college and do that for the next 50 years, those people will struggle.
Yeah.
I think that's true for skills, but if you think about it, this conference, Sam Zell said this morning that he believes that a lot of the biggest manufacturing businesses from Japan are going to move to Mexico, and therefore he's invested in Mexico. Now, an investor is here that's a client of ours, and how will they get up to, how do they know that that's right? How do they learn about whether that's true? That's not really a skill issue. It takes real perspective to know whether that can be true, and a really global perspective on a lot of different things. And so you can't really get that perspective for someone who hasn't seen that kind of cycle, who understands the political landscape in Mexico and Japan, for example, the development of industry.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say is in an interesting way, with the baby boomers retiring, what you also are seeing are huge skill gaps that are being left, particularly in the scientific area. If you look at aerospace, pharma, even consumer goods, you're seeing a whole layer of knowledge just exiting the workforce. And a lot of these companies are realizing that they need to find ways to re-engage with this population. In other words, you may have some leverage that you don't realize because the knowledge that this whole group has isn't yet replicated. And so I think there are companies like Alexander's and others that are helping to bridge that knowledge gap with enabling work for people who have a lot of experience. So I think there are increasing opportunities, but it's a great question. I can't see if there are other questions. We're just about out of time. I see a number. I'll let the microphone choose.
Yeah, I think a lot of the people working in the just-in-time economy are probably doing it because they want to be doing it, they enjoy the flexibility. But I'm wondering if your panel is kind of glossing over the fact that many people who are in that position don't necessarily want to be there. And what does that sort of do for the economy and for the people in it? And what's the future for those people?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the biggest things to watch in the next few years is, do a lot of the people that are performing in that economy get reclassified as employees of those companies? I think a lot of these business models are predicated on, a labor force of, thousands, if not millions, of independent contractors. But if you're telling someone what to do every day, telling them, where to go pick someone up for a ride or to deliver groceries to someone's house, is that person an independent contractor? Right. It's a big deal It's a much bigger deal than I think it's been portrayed as in the press. So I think that will be a big question, because things like health insurance, all the other pieces, kind of the safety net pieces that we give to employees, disappear or are minimized in that environment. So it's a big deal for our economy right now.
It's a big deal. And I'd also say our labor laws are antiquated. They're based on a very old model of what work means. And I think one of the things we have to recognize is whether these models are going to sustain or not, the law needs to offer protections that are typical for employees to groups of people who may be independent contractors. And so that's a piece of work I think the government has to take on to protect legitimate interests of people who may be considered independent. I think we're about done with our panel, but this has been really, for me at least, interesting to hear what folks are thinking about and where they think the world of work is going. I want to thank our panelists and our audience, and hope that we will all be around to see our predictions come true.